LifeStories Live.
So I remember there were lots of things like that happening. And I kind of started to become a bit more, as I said, introverted. And I was looking at my contemporaries around me in the industry, and I began to see that they also were struggling. There was drug addiction and alcohol abuse and relationship abuse or workaholism. I'm sure all of us listening can relate to ways that we are trying to find this kind of rest or this kind of satisfaction with ourselves and with our lives in all these different ways. And I could see that they also were battling and struggling in rehab. And I thought this just started to begin this, as I said, this yearning, this sense of missing and lack and confusion, I think, because I couldn't understand why I would be feeling this way. I'd sort of ticked all the world's boxes that equal success or satisfaction or happiness. And I was beginning to see that world really spun on performance, that we lived on a very performance-driven world. Your position, your title, your bank balance, your car, all these exteriors which were supposed to give you value or meaning and purpose, wasn't giving it to me. And I think that was a very poignant time in my life, of a bittersweet moment, if you like, because I was becoming down, a little depressive. I was very insecure, and I started to have panic attacks. But it would be in the storm that God was going to meet me, because he was able to ready my heart to look outside of myself, outside of my strengths, for help. And I remember one particular evening, I was in a pretty bad state. I was having several kind of panic attacks a day, and I'd become agoraphobic, so I didn't want to go out. And it was a really dark night for me. I was very close to really questioning what purpose I had, despite all this attention and adoration and worship that I had been given. I was without peace of mind. I was very needy, panicky, that I couldn't give you what you wanted. Connecting that to growing up, I wasn't the right color, I didn't fit in there. All these things were all sort of coming in to collide and meet with each other. And that night I remember questioning my life. And then just taking, I was in my bed, I didn't want to get out. It was just a mess, really. And crying out to God, I think. I didn't know which God. I'd taken several avenues. I was reading a lot of spiritual books on Buddhism. I'd been to a few Buddhist meetings and met wonderful people, all on their journey to find truth, I think, and God. I had met, I had been reading the Hadith, the Quran, met great Muslim people. And slowly God had been bringing me, to that narrow road. He said, narrow is the road that leads to life, and broad is the road that leads to destruction. And I was definitely on that broad road. And he seemed to be narrowing that road down, you know. And I was asking big questions like, okay, I want to find God. I don't know whose God it is. Which God is it? I want to find a God that I can worship because I believe he answers me and gives me truths and proves truth to me and is master of this world. And it's not in there, and it's not in that, and it's not in all these crystals that I was buying, all these candles, all these angel cards. All of it was just narrowing me down to the one path I didn't want to look at, which is Christianity. And if I'm honest with you tonight, I knew nothing really about the author of the Bible. I knew nothing about God's son and his story of redemption and relationship with his creation. I'd only known stories through media, and they weren't good stories, different, you know, just. So anyway, that night, I remember crying out and saying, God, if you are there, if you are real, if you are there, I want to know you. Do you want to know me? Can I make this connection in this darkness? And I remember asking my mother if we had a Bible in the house. And we did. And I remember she left the room and she gave me this book. And I remember opening this book and I don't know what I read. Now I think it was probably one of the Psalms, one of the songs about God, one of the books about songs that have been written about God and life. And anyway, I read something and I can only try and describe what happened after the reading. I experienced intimately a warmth that went through, or went around me perhaps from my head down like a blanket. And it included this sense of joy and peacefulness and rest and calm. so much so that I laid back and just didn't want it to stop. And I knew that my journey had ended. I knew that I had met with something sacred and something divine. And it had to do with the author of this book. I didn't know anything about God Almighty, as I said before, but I then made that decision to find out what is going on. And so I made a decision in the morning to visit a church, a local church if possible. And a few days later, on the Sunday, I remember going to my local church up the road, which was in Highgate at the time. And I remember going into this church and kind of nobody spoke to me, nobody met me. It was kind of tall, airy, darkish, echoey, and pretty unpleasant, frankly. And I remember listening and these kind of songs that were sung and then leaving, and still nobody had spoken to me. And I remember putting my head down and thinking, well, whatever happened to me yesterday or a few days ago it's nothing to do with church. I don't know, I don't understand. And put my head down and I turned the corner of my street, and here again is where God met me. I bumped into a young lady called Bonnie, literally. And now Bonnie used to bleach my hair. She was a hairdresser in Top Salon when I was very successful a few years before. And Bonnie was a good time girl. God, Bonnie was a girl, if I'd go out, we'd come back wrecked. She'd be totally wrecked and having done all kinds of things. And I began talking to her and looking at her. And she's chatting, what are you doing here? Yazz, really good to see you. Let's go for a coffee. What you're doing. So I said, well, actually, Bonnie, I've just been in church and, I'm just coming home and what are you doing? And I'm just looking at her thinking, who are you? She was so different. She was so, when I say different, she was just so alive and comfortable with herself. And Bonnie had a mouth like a sewer, and that had gone, and she just had something about her. Anyway, we went for this coffee, and eventually I said to her, what's happened to you, your life, Bonnie? Tell me. And she said, well, yes, I've met with the person Jesus in my life, and I'm following Jesus. I've become a Christian. And I nearly fell off my chair. I just couldn't believe it. And that is how God needs to deal with me anyway. I needed to see how a relationship that is spiritually connected to God could work in someone's life, is real in someone's life, is actually transforming someone's life. I remember years later being invited to Northern Ireland and sitting in an event called Real Lives in a church. And on my left was an IRA bomber who had become a Christian. And on my right was the father who had lost a child in the bombing in the Lockerbie disaster. It was a disaster where an airplane had flown over and been blown up, and many people were lost. And we're sitting together sharing our stories about faith. And I remember sitting there thinking, who could do this? Who can do this? Who can bring such pain and suffering to fellowship and forgiveness and love and brotherhood? And it is the person of Jesus. Jesus Christ had brought these two and me together. And it was just that, like that day. And I said to her, well, you know, I don't know what I've just walked into there, but I've met something about Jesus in you today. And I want to explore that more. And she said, you come to my church, girl. We got carpet on the floor. We got a pastor with a sense of humor. You know, we got great music. You come on down. Anyway, I couldn't wait. And so my journey continued into that church. And it was a small, very small church in North London. And it was warm, very inviting. People were relaxed, welcoming. And I remember, I think the second Sunday, I mean, I'd taken everyone, my daughter, my mother, and I remember that day sitting at the back of the church, like you do. I was hiding, you know, behind the pillar when you first start. And the pastor man was preaching on a story from the parable called The Prodigal Son. And it was as if he was talking to me that day. And I remember thinking, how is that possible, Eva? How is that possible? This is a 1,000-year-old book. You know, they keep telling me this book and the words in this book are eternal because these are the words of God who is eternal and infinite.
LifeStories Live.
You know, and it's weird because this book is talking to me today in the 21st century about my life. And the story is about two sons who are with their father. One son decides to stay at home. The other son asks his father for his inheritance. He wants to go out into the world and get out there. And he does, and he parties and kind of lives this sort of wild life, and then slowly wakes up and realizes that his life has become very wasteful and he's lost purpose and meaning to it. And as a Jewish person, he's actually reached the state of eating pig food because he's so hungry and he's lost everything. So it's probably one of the most difficult and disgraceful and degrading things at the time. And the pastor's telling this story, and he says, and this son says to himself, well, look at my life. Look at my life. Look where I am. And he said, I would be much better with my father than I am here. And I want to return to my father. Even if he takes me on as a hired hand, it will be better than this place that I'm living in. And the scripture says, and he came to his senses. And it was as if, I don't know, as if that sacred person that I had met and kept meeting was speaking to me. come to your senses. And the story continues that the son gets up and he starts to walk back home. And there's this extraordinary moment in the story where you get a picture of God, of the image of God and of God's heart. Because it says, and his father sees his son from far off. And the parable really is symbolic of God in the Father's life, who sees his son, who sees us. However far away we are from him, he is still there, waiting, and he sees you. And when you return to him, it said in the story that the son sees his father, and his father sees his son, and his father begins to run. He begins to run to his son. He's not walking, he's not berating, he's not holding some kind of club that, yeah, well, it's just your fault. You know, you went out, you did this, you did that. He is running to his son, and he embraces his son. And he kisses his neck. And he says, oh, son, you were lost. So lost, and now you're found. He says, I said you were dead, but now you're alive. He says, let's hold a party. And there are further scriptures in the Bible where God talks about rejoicing over one person who comes to him and celebrating, and that he will go out for that one person among the thousands who turn to him. And anyway, that day something in me broke, and I wanted to really know, who is this God? And who is this person, Jesus, who has, I think I had such admiration for the man first. I couldn't understand that God, in his plan for redemption and bringing us back to himself, could come in flesh and had come in the person of Jesus. So I really just admired Jesus, the person who loved women, loved children, his teachings on life, on right living, on caring, his instructions that we are to care for one another, to pray for one another, to support one another, to welcome the stranger, to never condemn the immigrant or the refugee. His teaching on being created in the image of God, which means that we are created in dignity and noble and valuable with inherent eternal value. It's profound, his teachings. And then slowly, I began to recognize that Christ was not just human, but he was man through his miracles, through the fulfilling of all the prophecies that had been spoken about him that I was learning in the Old Testament, in the Bible, were fulfilled in this person. Anyway, so I joined a group called a Seekers Group. I think you can join Alpha courses or Christianity Exploring courses today. And I joined with lots of group of people who were like-minded, all looking for truth and answers. And slowly everyone was left but me. Some people had become Christians and some were still searching. And I was left with this amazing pastor who I kept coming week after week. And slowly, patiently, he began to introduce me to Christ and what he had done for me, and to introduce me to sin. Because I didn't really understand sin. And when sin began, He began to teach me about the very beginning of our humanity, how we'd fallen away from God because we were being disobedient to God. And the consequences of us falling away from God was that we began to live this skewed life, this life of imbalance and having a nature that will draw us to do wrong and draw us to cheat and draw us to lie and draw us to cover ourselves. And and it began to make sense. Sin began to make sense to me. Finally, it was answering my questions of
Life Stories. Life Stories Live.